Abandoned mail-order bride was left in a snowstorm with no shoes, until a Lakota warrior wrapped her in his cloak. "What? You're not pure?" The words cracked through the frozen air like a rifle shot. Josephine Burke blinked, stunned, as the wind flung her hair into her eyes and the snow stung her cheeks. "I don't marry ruined women," the man snarled, voice rising over the roar of the wind. "I don't care what you wrote in your letters. You lied. You're damaged goods, and I don't hitch myself to shame." Jo opened her mouth, breath trembling. "I never lied. I told you I taught school, that I had no family left." "You left out that someone else's hands had already been on you," he spat, his lip curling. "You think a man like me would marry a woman with a past? I paid for purity." They were only halfway across the Black Hills, the storm closing in fast. Snow swirled around the horse-drawn wagon, the canvas cover whipping like a torn sail. Jo stood on the frozen ground, her wool coat flapping open at the hem, hands shaking as her fiancé Samuel Kearns, merchant of fine goods and foul tempers, stepped down from the wagon with disgust in his eyes. "I came all this way," Jo said, voice cracking. "You wrote me. You begged me to come. I sold everything I had for the train, for this. That was before I knew you were tainted." He turned, picked up her travel bag, and tossed it into the snow at her feet. "You think you can trick me into honor? I won't be shackled to a woman who was someone else's first. You're nothing but a fraud in a corset." Jo gasped as he shoved her backward hard. Her feet slipped on the packed snow, and she tumbled to her knees, landing with a dull thud that jarred her spine. The cold bit through her gloves and into her bones. Samuel mounted his horse without another glance, yanked the reins, and turned back toward the trail they had come from. "Find your way back if you can," he called over his shoulder. "Or don't. Doesn't matter to me." And then he was gone, swallowed by the white. Jo sat frozen for a moment, not from cold but from the sheer brutality of what had just happened. Her ears rang. Her mouth tasted of blood and disbelief. She looked around at the endless, unforgiving snow and the gray sky pressing low above her. "Samuel," she screamed, her voice hoarse and cracking. "Samuel, please." No answer. She stumbled to her feet, grabbed her bag, and staggered forward, trying to follow the tracks his horse had left. The wind howled, snow blowing sideways, stealing her breath. Each step felt heavier than the last, her limbs already numb. She slipped once, then twice, catching herself with raw hands. The third time she went down hard, face first, and stayed there for a long moment, chest heaving, heart hammering in her ears. She forced herself up, lips trembling. "Don't cry," she whispered. "You're not going to cry." But the tears came anyway, freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. She kept walking. The sky was a blur, the horizon lost. Trees in the distance vanished behind walls of white. Her feet burned, then stopped burning altogether. It was not until she stumbled again and fell flat on her back that she noticed her boots were gone. She sat up, gasping, and looked down. Her feet were bare, bloodied, the toes blue-tinged and raw. Her shoes had slipped off at some point, sucked away by the snow, and she had not even noticed. The pain had faded into numbness so quickly it frightened her. She laughed then. A sharp, broken sound. "Of course," she muttered. "Of course you took my dignity and my shoes." Her voice echoed emptily, lost in the storm. She tried to rise again, but her legs buckled beneath her. She dropped to her knees, then collapsed to her side, snow rising up to meet her like a pillow, soft and merciless. Her vision blurred. The cold crept into her lungs. Her body began to shake, then stilled. Somewhere in her fading mind, she remembered reading that people who froze to death often felt warm at the end. She wondered if that would be her. Abandoned, barefoot, bleeding into snow, left to die in a place no one would find her. She closed her eyes and waited. The snow had begun to settle like a shroud when the wolf came. White against white, it moved soundlessly through the drifts, its breath a pale fog in the frigid air. Eyes like amber fire blinked once, twice, then locked onto the crumpled shape lying in the snow. Josephine did not stir. Behind the wolf came the man, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy cloak made of stitched pelts and bone toggles. His face was darkened by wind and sun, framed by thick black hair tied loosely behind his neck. He moved with the silence of the wild, no crunch, no breath wasted, and when he knelt beside her, his fingers were cautious but sure. The man pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat, then studied the blue beneath her fingernails, the blood on her bare feet. She was still alive, barely. He scooped her up with no sound, no words, Her head lolled against his chest, lips parted in a soft, unconscious sigh. Her skin was cold. Her dress was torn and stiff with frost. He felt her bones beneath the fabric like splinters. With the wolf trailing beside him, he carried her through a break in the trees, down into a gully, and then up again into a ridge path few feet had ever touched. Half an hour passed. The storm howled, but he did not flinch. At last they reached a narrow cleft in the mountainside, hidden behind a fallen pine and rock stained with lichen. Inside was a cave, deep, dry, and warm with the scent of wood smoke. A small fire crackled in a ring of stones. Furs lined the back wall, and bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling like dried wings. He laid her down near the fire, wrapped her in a thick bison skin, and rubbed her limbs with a salve of bear grease and sweet roots. He worked in silence, like a man who knew death and how to ward it off. The wolf circled once, then lay at her feet, its body coiled like a living sentry. The man sat down across the fire and watched her. She had not yet opened her eyes. He knew this woman was not from his world. Her dress, though soaked and torn, was made from fine material, Eastern stitched. Her hands were soft, her face narrow and pale, but her jaw had a stubborn tilt, even in sleep. He had seen women like her in the settlements, proper, bitter, judgmental. But this one had walked into the mouth of winter alone. No settler woman did that. He did not wake her. He let the fire do its work. Only after several hours did he speak, and not to her. He spoke to the wolf. "They always come here," he said in Lakota, "to escape something, to bury something. And they think the snow will forget it for them." The wolf did not respond. He stared into the flames, jaw set. Years ago, he had a name among the Lakota that was spoken with pride. He had fought in defense of their land, had believed in honor, in strength, in the old ways. But in the final winter war he had ridden into battle under a flag of peace, only to be met with bullets and betrayal. Captured, tortured, left for dead. When he returned, scarred and broken, his people turned their backs. They called him traitor. Said he had spoken things to the soldiers. Things that got brothers and cousins killed. He had not. But he did not beg to be believed. He left. Walked into the hills and did not return. He had lived there since. With the wolves, with the trees, with silence. No laws, no tribe, no lies. And now, here she was. Another stray. Another soul cast off. He did not know her story. But he would keep her alive. That much he owed no one but himself. The first thing she noticed was the fire. It cracked softly nearby, casting shadows on the stone walls around her. The air smelled of smoke and cedar, of something earthy and strange but not unpleasant. Her eyes fluttered open, dry and stinging, and for a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet pop of flame and the wind moaning faintly beyond rock. Then she sat up, fast. Her body screamed in protest, and she cried out, clutching the heavy fur draped around her shoulders. She looked down and saw that her feet were wrapped in linen, and something that looked like softened leather. Her coat had been removed. Her hands trembled. "Where?" she started. A low grunt came from the far side of the fire. She turned. A man sat cross-legged beside the flames, half in shadow. His cloak of furs hung loose, revealing a broad chest and arms carved by weather and work. His face was hard, unreadable, with dark eyes that studied her like a wild animal deciding whether to approach. Behind him, a white wolf lay still, golden eyes trained on her. Joe froze. "Who are you?" she asked, voice brittle. The man pointed to a wooden bowl at her side. "Eat," he said. Then, after a pause, warm. "Stay." She stared at him. "Do you speak English?" The man gave no answer. Her heart pounded. "Where am I?" Still silence. "I have to leave," she said, gathering the edge of the fur around her. "I have to go back. There's a town not far." "Storm," he said, cutting her off. "No road. No mercy." She rose, ignoring the pain in her legs, but her knees buckled. She fell against the wall with a groan. The man stood, crossed the space between them in 2 quiet steps. She flinched, but he only lifted her gently and placed her back beside the fire. "I am not your prisoner," she snapped. "No," he said simply. "You are cold." She glared at him, lips tight. "They think I'm weak, that I ran, that I begged. I didn't. He left me." The man said nothing. Joe's voice broke. "They'll be telling lies already. They'll say I seduced him, that I deserved it. I have to go back. I have to clear my name." The man crouched and stirred the fire with a stick, eyes distant. Then, in a voice like gravel and snow, Honor does not live in places where people laugh at another's pain. She blinked. What? He didn't repeat it. She sat still, stunned, the words echoing in her head. They stayed like that for a long time, two strangers seated by firelight, separated by silence and lives neither could imagine. The wolf huffed once, shifted closer to its master's knee. Joe looked down at the bowl beside her. Steam still rose from the thick stew inside, meat, herbs, and something else that smelled sharp and old. She lifted the spoon with trembling hands and ate. The man did not smile. He simply watched. And so began the strange rhythm of days. They said little. She could walk only a few feet at first, then a little more. He gave her space but always watched. She kept to one side of the fire. He kept to the other. He would vanish at dawn and return at dusk with roots, meat, firewood. She would heat the stones and prepare what little she knew to cook. They did not trust. But they did not leave. Two souls with nowhere else to go. The snow outside fell soft as ash, settling onto the pines like powdered ghosts. The wind had died sometime after dusk, leaving behind only the faint sighs of the forest and the low hum of the fire inside the cave. The flames burned steady, casting amber light across stone walls and the shadows that had learned to live there. Joe sat cross-legged on a bed of furs, the edges stitched with worn sinew. She held a carved wooden bowl between her palms, letting the warmth seep into her skin. Steam rose in slow ribbons from the stew, elk, she guessed, though she had stopped asking days ago. It didn't matter, not anymore. Across from her, Ska sat hunched over a long knife, sharpening the blade with deliberate, even strokes. His hands were stained and calloused, his focus unwavering. It was a motion she had seen him repeat a dozen times, and yet it still mesmerized her. There was something grounding in the way he worked, as though the world couldn't unravel so long as he kept that rhythm. They had lived like this for days now, perhaps weeks. Time had lost its shape. There were no clocks, no chiming church bells, no voices to mark the passing hours. She no longer measured in minutes. Now she measured in firewood burned, in the number of words he chose to speak, in the silence between wolf howls. Tonight, that silence felt different, less heavy, less guarded. Joe set her bowl aside and leaned back on her hands, watching the shadows shift across the cave walls. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just stayed away from people altogether? Ska didn't look up. I tried. She smiled, not mockingly, but with a flicker of understanding. Didn't work, I guess. He shrugged, one slow movement of the shoulder. Her voice softened. I used to teach children, back in Vermont. That caught his attention. The scraping of stone against steel paused mid-stroke. I wasn't much for needlework or hymn singing like my sisters, she continued. But I could teach a boy to read. I could make a girl believe she could be something more than a wife or a servant. I was proud of that. The fire cracked, sending sparks up into the dark. Then one day, a letter I'd written, to a man I hadn't even met, was found tucked inside a book. Someone turned it over to the school board. They said it was indecent, temptress talk, that I was unfit to mold young minds. Ska glanced at her then, not with judgment, not pity, just the steady attention of someone who'd seen enough of life to know when a story came from the gut. Joe's fingers curled around the edge of the fur blanket. I didn't lie. I didn't seduce anyone. I just wanted something of my own, a voice in a world that kept telling me to hush. Her breath trembled. And still, she whispered, they sent me away, like rot on the root. Ska set the blade down on the stone floor. He was quiet for a beat, then unfastened the cloak around his shoulders, pushing the heavy fabric aside. With a slow, practiced motion, he tugged down the front of his tunic, exposing a chest marked not just by wind and war, but by betrayal. From shoulder to ribs, a jagged scar curved like a lash across his skin, puckered, deep, angry. Joe gasped softly. What happened? He didn't answer at first. When he did, his voice was quiet. Peace flag. Winter of '76. I rode with 6 others to speak to the bluecoats. No weapons, just voices. Her eyes widened. They shot first. She stared. I crawled for 3 days. Found my way back. His jaw tightened. They thought I told the soldiers where to aim, where to strike. Her breath hitched. You didn't? No, he said simply. But they needed someone to blame. Joe's eyes burned, not with tears, but with the heat of recognition. They cast you out. He nodded once. They burned my desk, she said. threw my books into the street. The fire between them crackled louder. And something shifted. Not pity. Not forgiveness. Kinship. Joe reached over and broke the last piece of flatbread in her bowl, held it out to him. A quiet offering. Scott took it. Their fingers brushed, warm, rough, real. For a long moment they sat in silence. Not empty silence, but one rich with unspoken truths. The cave didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like shelter. Like the world had been stripped down to its bones, and what was left was something true. Joe looked into the fire, her voice a whisper. They thought we were dangerous. Scott's gaze stayed on the flame. They were right. And in that flickering light, they were no longer white and red, no longer a schoolteacher and an outcast, no longer broken. They were survivors. And they had found each other. It was late afternoon when she saw them, just beyond the edge of the ridge, their figures moving slow through the forest like ants along a crooked line. Wagons. Joe stood on a high slope, breath sharp in the cold, eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of sunlight glinting off canvas and steel. There was no mistaking it. A supply run from the nearest town. She could hear the faint clink of harnesses, the crunch of wheels over frost-hardened ground. Her heart pounded. Behind her, the wolf gave a low huff. Beside her, Ska stood with his arms crossed, gaze already narrowed on what she'd seen. "It's the town," she said quietly. "They're just a few miles off. I can make it before nightfall." Ska said nothing. Joe turned to face him. "I need to go." He studied her face, her resolve, the light that had returned to her eyes in the weeks they'd spent together. "You are safe here," he said. She nodded. "I know. You are not ready for them." "I was not ready for him, either," she replied. Ska's jaw tightened. Joe stepped forward, voice steady. "I will not live like a shadow, hiding in caves, afraid of what others think of me. They took my name, my story. I'm going back to claim it. They will not listen. Then let them say it to my face." Her voice rose. "Let them call me a whore, and a fool, and everything else they whispered behind curtains. I'd rather be seen and hated than invisible and pitied." Ska's brows drew low. "They will hurt you." "They already did," she said. "But they will not do it without looking me in the eye this time." A long silence followed. The snow between them seemed to still. Ska turned away, looked toward the trees. Joe waited, her hands curling at her sides. "Say something." He said nothing. When he finally looked back, his eyes were darker than the sky behind her. "You do not need to prove yourself to people who would leave you to die," he said. "I'm not doing it for them," she answered. "I'm doing it for me." He gave a single nod, sharp and tight. "Then go." Joe flinched, just slightly. "I thought you might stop me." "I don't own you." She lowered her gaze. "No, you don't." She gathered what little she had, wool gloves, a small satchel, a strip of dried meat he'd packed without a word, and stepped past him. The wolf stood as she did, eyes flicking between them. "Thank you," she said softly. Ska did not respond. She looked at him one last time. He stood still, framed by snow and trees, as unmoving as the mountain. Joe turned. She walked. Ska watched her go, arms at his sides, fists clenched just enough for the bones to show through the skin. He did not follow. Did not call her back. But long after her footsteps faded into the hush of winter, he stood there. Eyes locked on the place where she had vanished, as if the snow itself might return her. The town looked smaller than she remembered. As Joe walked through the snow-packed main street, heads turned, conversation stopped. Children were pulled inside by their mothers, and shop doors closed a little too quickly. The silence had a weight to it, thicker than judgment, colder than wind. She kept her chin high, her step steady. She had changed since they last saw her, her face more drawn, her eyes darker, her body leaner. But it was not just the weeks in the mountains that set her apart now. It was the way she moved. Like someone who had already survived the worst. She reached the square and stopped. A group of men stood in front of the general store. One of them stepped forward, sneering. "Well, well, look what the wolves dragged in." Joe didn't flinch. A woman on the porch gasped. "That's her. The one who ran off with that savage." Another voice shouted from across the street, "You sleep with animals, you turn into one." Laughter rose, harsh, ugly. Then someone threw the first stone. It struck her shoulder, not hard, but enough to make her stagger.
More followed, snowballs packed with ice, a chunk of mud, a half-rotten apple.
Her bonnet was torn from her head by a boy no older than 10. He whooped as it flew into the snow, then shouted, "Witch!" Still, Joe did not run. She stood there, cheeks burning, eyes bright with fury, chest heaving. "I came back," she shouted. "Not for your forgiveness, for the truth." A man spat. "The truth is, you're nothing but a whore in a fur coat." Another voice hissed, "Where's your Indian now, girl? Where's your hero?" And then the wind shifted. A silence fell so suddenly it rang louder than the shouting before it. From the tree line behind the church, a figure emerged. He walked slowly, cloak dragging in the snow, the great white wolf beside him like a shadow with teeth. Eyes followed his every step, wide, uncertain. Joe turned, breath caught in her throat.
Ska moved through the crowd like smoke, and the people parted without knowing why.
When he reached her, he didn't speak at first. He simply reached down and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle, his eyes fierce. Then, with deliberate care, he took off his cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders. Facing the crowd, he spoke with a voice that did not shout, yet struck like thunder. "You left her in the snow." He looked at each face in turn. "You fed her to the cold, to the dark, because you were afraid of her strength." No one answered. "She survived. And you mock her for it." Someone whispered, "She's not one of us." "She was never yours," Ska said, "and you were never hers." He stepped forward, placing himself between Joe and the mob. "But she is mine," he said quietly. "Not owned, not claimed. Chosen." The words fell like stone in water. Joe stared up at him, tears forming, not from pain but from something older, deeper. Recognition, home. And for the first time, the townspeople, those who had called her names, who had thrown stones, looked away. Because there are some truths you cannot spit at.
Some loves you cannot shame?
Scott turned to her. "Are you ready?" She nodded. And together they walked away, through the square, past the wagons, past the stairs. The snow fell gently around them, and no one dared follow. Not because of fear, but because something sacred had passed through their midst. And none of them could touch it. They never looked back. Not once.
As they left the edge of the town behind, the silence between them was not heavy, it was complete. The kind that comes after something final, something chosen. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The white wolf moved ahead, tail flicking through the trees like a banner. Ska walked with his usual calm, but Joe sensed something gentler in the set of his shoulders. She followed him without question, every step taking her farther from a world that had never truly welcomed her and closer to one that did not ask her to explain herself. By dusk, they had reached the mountains again. This time, they did not return to the old cave. Ska led her higher, through a grove of evergreens, to a ridge where the sun broke open the sky each morning. There, with stone and timber, they built a new shelter, wider, warmer, with a view of the valley far below. Joe worked beside him, learning with her hands what he had long known with his bones. She stitched leather with sinew, learned which herbs soothed wounds and which ones summoned sleep. Her fingers grew calloused, her arms stronger. The pale of her skin deepened with sun and ash. And the silence that had once stretched between them began to fill, not with words, but with living. She no longer counted days. She counted firewood stacked, meals cooked, the feel of his presence beside her while she slept. There were no church bells, no papers signed, no witnesses. Only a fire that never went out and two hearts that beat in rhythm, with snow melt, and the howl of distant wolves. Then one evening, after a long day of carving stone and boiling roots, Joe sat beside the fire, wrapped in a cloak of her own stitching. Ska sat nearby, mending a bowstring. The wolf snored beside them, paws twitching in dreams. Joe stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. "When I was a girl," she said, "I used to imagine being chosen by a man, by a church, by a town. I thought love had to be given permission." Ska did not answer. He rarely did when she wandered into memory. She turned her head, eyes catching the firelight. "I don't want permission anymore." He looked up then, still waiting. "I choose you," she said simply. "Not because I'm supposed to, not because anyone says I should, but because every part of me that was lost found its way back in you." The wolf lifted its head at her voice, then rested it again. Ska set the bowstring aside. He didn't smile, but he nodded once. And in that silence, under stars older than any law, beside a fire that had never needed blessing, it was done. No vows, no rings, only two people. And a promise written not in words, but in the life they built, the pain they endured, and the truth they no longer needed to defend. Because wolves do not ask permission. And neither did they. A year passed. The winters still came hard in the Black Hills, but the stories came harder. It began with a trapper half-drunk in a saloon, telling of a pair he saw near the northern ridge. A woman with hair like copper flame and a man darker than shadow, silent as snow. They lived high above the pines in a stone house smoke-fed and guarded by a great white wolf. "Didn't speak," he said, slurring into his drink, "just looked at me like I didn't belong in my own skin." Then came the boy. 8 years old, lost from a wagon train for nearly 2 days. found by a search party 3 miles off route, warm and fed and clutching a pine whistle carved with care. He spoke little at first, just stared into the fire with wide eyes and a quiet smile. But when they asked who saved him, he answered plainly, a red-haired woman. She gave me honey, told me wolves don't bite unless you chase them. What else did she say? Someone asked. He smiled again. She said the best word is freedom. She taught me how to say it. The town grew quiet after that. No one said the names, but they all knew. Joe and Scow were no longer seen, not in markets or along the trails, but the signs were there, hearth smoke on far-off ridges, snares reset with care, children's stories whispered of the wolf bride who once wore town shoes and now walked barefoot on stone. They didn't ask where she went, because some truths don't require a map. She had not disappeared. She had chosen, and in doing so, she had rewritten a fate no one else dared touch. There were no pictures, no markers, no record in church ledgers or county books, but there was memory in the eyes of the boy who now carried a whistle on a string, in the wary silence of hunters who never dared set traps in that part of the woods again.
And in the words left behind by a mail carrier who once braved the pass and saw two figures dancing around a fire under a moonlit sky, no music but the wind, no audience but the wolves. They were not ghosts. They were alive. And they had built something beyond forgiveness, beyond law, beyond shame. A life not handed down or bargained for. A life claimed. A home forged by scarred hands and stitched with quiet devotion. And so, when the snow fell again, heavier than the year before, those who remembered told their children, "They don't live in our world anymore." And the wiser ones added softly, "They live in the world they chose." Because wolves don't ask permission. And love, when it's real, never has to. If this story moved you, if you believe love belongs to the brave, not the perfect, then you've just stepped into the kind of world we live for here. At Wild West Love Stories, we don't just tell tales of the frontier, we give voice to the hearts that history forgot. From outlawed romance to snowbound redemption, we honor every woman who stood her ground and every man who loved her without permission. Subscribe now to join us on more journeys through firelight, freedom, and the kind of love that outlives time. Hit the bell so you never miss a story forged in the wild and remembered in the heart. Wild West Love Stories. Where bullets missed, but hearts didn't.